Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now today I want to talk about a book that a lot of financial people chat about. It's called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Now if you've read it before, you know that these points can change your life. And if you haven't read it before, hopefully these tips will help you. But first of all, I'm Jodie. I've worked in finance in London for the last 10 years. And I just started a YouTube channel to talk about finance for the crack. So hopefully these tips will be helpful for you guys. If you want to find financial freedom, learn how to invest, be better with your money, hopefully this channel will help. Now, let's get into the video. Now, the first tip I want to talk about for Rich Dad, Poor Dad is that he talks about prioritizing assets over liabilities. And then he talks about what is an asset, what is a liability. So if you're not familiar with this term, an asset is something that can make you money, and a liability is something that does not make you money and is just something that costs you. So he's basically saying to prioritize to have more assets in your life rather than liabilities. So examples of assets can be owning a property, owning stocks, owning shares, bonds, things like that. And things like liabilities can be basically anything you buy that doesn't give you money. A car, for example, can be an asset or a liability depending on how you use it. If it's, you're getting a loan on a big ass car, that is of course a liability, because the car will usually go down in value as well as you owing something on it, so that is costing you money. Whereas if you buy a car to become a taxi driver, for example, that could be argued that that's an asset because you're bringing in money. However, of course, if you get a big ass loan on a Range Rover and then you're an Uber driver that doesn't cover those costs, then it is still a liability. So it's a really interesting twist that he really focuses on this mentality of understanding what you own is an asset and what is a liability in your current life. The second point then that he speaks about is to try and make money work for you. So the concept here is that if you're working a 9-to-5 job, you're basically exchanging your time for money. So you will have, a salary, you'll have a paycheck, that kind of thing. So in a sense, you are, trapped in a box there because you're never going to exceed that amount of money. Let's say you get paid 30 grand a year for your 9-to-5 job. You will only ever make 30 grand unless you get a promotion, unless you work elsewhere, but you're still exchanging your time for money in those jobs, even if you get a promotion. So what he's saying here is to try and make your money work for you. So what he means by this is if you get into investing, for example, in an S&P 500 index fund, if you invest into that, if you don't know how to do that, I will do a future video on how to begin on investing. But essentially what he's saying is to put money into investments and then make the money work for you so you can get compound interest on that. So what that means is if you, let's say, put in £100 every month into the S&P 500, for the next 10 years, let's say, you will start to get interest on top of that money that's sitting there. So if it's an automatic payment, it's freely coming out of your bank account every month. You don't even have to think about it. And that money is then working for you by, growing in the market, hopefully. There are dips, of course, in investing. You have to be aware of that. But anywhere where there's growth or dips or whatever, you will get interest on top of the principal, aka the chunk of money that you have in that investment account. So that's what he speaks about a lot is, how are there ways where you can make money, in better ways rather than exchanging it for time? So the third point then that he talks about is to try and become financially independent. And again, this links up with investing, but of course there's other ways to be financially independent. You can of course start your own business, and with that, with any entrepreneurship, venture that you go on, there is no ceiling. You can make as much money as you want to make in those areas if you're in the right sector, of course. And there are a lot of people that fail in businesses, so there is that to remember as well. If your passion and heart isn't behind something, then of course it's more likely to fail. But what he's saying here is if you are your own boss, which he talks about in this book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Basically, he had his own biological dad, which was the poor dad, and then he had his neighbour's friend's dad, which was the rich dad who had his own business and had a lot of property and made money work for him. So he's really taken these concepts of what he learned when he was a young kid and relaying it as an adult, for us all to learn about. So the fact that he's really, bringing home to be financially independent where you can. If you can set up your own business, that's amazing. And if it works out, hooray for everyone. If you can get into investing and make your money work for you better that way. And also to increase your financial intelligence. So reading books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, watching finance videos like this, increasing your knowledge and understanding, how you can get that step ahead. So the fourth thing he tends to talk about is calculated risks. Now you tend to hear that a lot of, richer people will take risks, but they're more calculated risks. And what they mean by this is to really kind of go for things, and if you fail, to learn from those failings and then to try again. So he, of course, talks about different businesses that he started, and maybe, they weren't the best and he failed in certain areas, but then he used that knowledge then to try another venture or to continue on the path in another direction. So really using your failings as, as a win and how you can get ahead with those. He also talks about having an abundance mindset. And what he means by this is, instead of saying, oh, I can't afford to do something, I can't afford to buy that property, I can't afford to live in that area, he flips it around and says, instead of I can't, how can I? So how can I afford that property? How am I able to live in that area one day? And flipping this mindset around is quite an interesting concept, really, because whatever you tell yourself, that becomes your mantra. Even if it's nothing to do with money, even if you say to yourself, I'm a loser, I'm not as, successful as my friends, my salary is like a lot less than people, I'm not as good as them, that becomes your truth then, everything you tell yourself. And the same thing is with money. If you keep saying to yourself, oh, I can't afford to live in London, London's so expensive, I'll never be able to have that dream become a reality. Or I can't afford to buy my first house, so I might as well not even try. If you kind of flip it around and kind of understand, okay, how can I get on the property ladder? Then it changes your mindset into a more of a positivity, mindset, but obviously makes you drill down and take the steps needed to get to that goal. And of course, you have to take this with a pinch of salt. He's not saying like you should, spend all your credit cards to buy, a load of shite that you felt like you couldn't afford before, or that you should get a big car loan to afford the car. He's not saying that. He's just saying, with the money that you have, or in the future, how can you afford those things? Not by getting into loads of personal debt. He does talk about how debt can be used as a leverage, such as mortgages, and how rich people tend to use debt as a leverage in that way to get ahead. But he's not talking about, maxing out your credit card, borrowing money from people and not being able to pay them back, living above your means. He's not saying that. So I guess it's to make sure that you're understanding that point fully. The fifth point then he talks about is to control your spending and to keep your debts low. So again, this links into try and get more assets under your belt and less liabilities, and also to try and live below your means a little bit as well. So let's say, for example, you get $3,000, that's what you're paid every month, okay? Are you currently, leaking into having to use credit cards at the end of the month? Maybe you're spending $3,500 instead of $3,000, or maybe you're spending 4 or 5. A lot of people tend to do that, and it's very disruptive behavior. So if you are getting paid $3,000, you should try and figure out, okay, how can I live below that means? Am I living in the wrong area potentially for now? Can I get a lodger in to give me money so it's more of an asset? If you've got a spare room or anything like that, to kind of generate money that way to live a better life. So it's really, try and live below your means and increase your assets to live that life you want. So the sixth point he talks about is to not work for money, but to work because you love it. And this kind of links in with, educating yourself about finances, to really enjoy what your working is. So whatever your passion is, if you do want to start a business, you should really go into the area that you're most passionate about, of course, because then you will give it the most time a day. You'll be happy to work overtime because it's the area that you've always wanted to work in, and not just to work in something because you've heard it's very profitable, because those are the types of businesses that tend to fail first. The seventh point he talks about is tax. Now, people's eyes always glaze over when people mention tax, and I have to put my hands up and say I'm not a tax expert at all, and I wish I knew a lot more about tax than I do. I have a pretty good knowledge about it, but I think there's always ways that you can learn more in tax, especially if you're thinking about becoming your own, business owner and things like that. It's especially with owning your own company, there are definitely tax benefits to doing that rather than having a 9-to-5 salary. And he goes into this in quite a lot of detail, especially because it's from an American standpoint. He talks about the benefits of being an entrepreneur and a business owner and the tax benefits of that, rather than getting taxed at a higher rate if you are an employee. So the last tip I want to talk about from the book Rich Dad Poor Dad is to change your mindset. And what he's saying here is, to basically take responsibility for the financial position that you're in. If you have a lot of debts right now, if you've got a load of car loans that are really expensive, if you've got a lot of student debt, things like that. He's saying to be responsible and take the next steps to actually tackle those things. Don't, bury your head in the sand. Don't ignore them for too long. It can be incredibly daunting, but, try and look to the future and take small steps every day to pay off debt, for example, if that's what you want to do. The Rich Dad Poor Dad book was one of the very first books that I actually listened to on Audible And, the physical copy I have in my flat too, I'll drop it as a link below if you're curious to read it. It's a really cool book and a really interesting book. And it's not just about finances, it's about, how you view your life as well. So hopefully that was helpful, guys. I tend to do 2 videos a week on personal finance bits and bobs. So if you find that helpful, give me a thumbs up and a subscribe if you find it useful. Okay, bye.